where we started was a simple one-day workshop, map building. Both, we included the founders and the other 10 people on the senior leadership team. We built one-on-one maps in the morning to get people to identify their individual resistance and big assumptions. And then we built a team map in the afternoon. And it was, Deb, it was absolutely transformational just in terms of their awareness. And it was very impactful to the extent that I think for the first time they saw how their big assumption was really creating sort of in the collective state this culture where people didn't feel like it was safe to have high value conversations. Conflict was anything that smacked of conflict was column 2. We're going to avoid that. And like a lot of clients, both with this company and others, they were so focused on changing the column 2 behavior, and they finally got into column 3 and column 4 and saw that, what was really creating this behavior that was so systemic and problematic and expensive. So it was, I guess in summary, they had a collective big assumption held across the leadership team around hard conversations, taking risks with each other, had created this very top-down culture where the founders, directed everything, so people didn't feel safe to come in and have disagreement. And it was a watershed moment for them to see that the founders had actually created this, and not out of their own assumptions about, I've got to control everything. I have to be the smartest person in the room. I can't give up control. Or we had one founder that's like, I have some level of imposter syndrome, and by gosh, I can't let you see that. So it really set the stage for the next 6 months of work, which was going through the entire coaching arc with the leadership team, all 12 people, from the 2 founders, all through the studio and the senior managers and all the principals. So in their industry, they have principals that run their different studios. So I took go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. So when they saw the maps, the individual maps and the collective map, they could see this is why we have this kind of situation where engagement is lower than we want it to be and people are leaving. They could tie that back to, here are the root causes of that.
Absolutely. We tied it and by the end of the day, we did a summary. So based on our map, what do we see around? What can this point to? What is the evidence that we're seeing that points to these symptoms that we find difficult to change? And they tied the dots together. They dotted the I's together because it was just they were willing to do the work. I mean, it was so apparent that they were in enough pain and that they had enough buy-in to realize that we've created this problem, and out of our own collective immunity. And we spent a lot of time in the pre-work of the workshop to talk about the whole notion of what is an immunity, how does it present, what are the symptoms, which is in terms of polarized thinking and predictive of outcomes. But they tied it all together. So the next 6 months was just literally taking all the leadership team through the arc. That was the bulk of my work. And I think that was probably in talking to the one founder, Rayanne, she was kind of my lead top level officer. That was probably the hardest point because you were not seeing like the impact yet. Yeah. We're doing this deep work. People are seeing things that they don't really want to see about themselves. And like, well, what's the result, right? How are we starting to see the result that we're looking for? And to their credit, they had faith that we're going to see something on the back end. And as we started, this is where the test design was so pivotal, is we started running tests pretty early in the arc, so they could start to see how things would change behaviorally, which is particularly around having hard conversations with each other, because they predicted all these like horrific outcomes. And we'd say, well, what did you learn about your assumption? And actually, how did the outcome that you predicted, how was it different? And then we'd update a continuum and we'd go back through. So I think probably that 4 to 6 month window where you're not, the traditional training, like, well, how are things different other than we're turning over, things that we don't want to see about ourselves, but are absolutely, we're getting a clear indicator of what's going on in our culture.
Yeah. And
so
you were coaching them each individually.
Each individually.
Right? Yeah.
Each individually.
Were you working at all with them as a team?
I would sit in 2 team meetings. I would facilitate interaction with, they had that LLC group that was their leadership, ownership group. And I would sit in there. So they had a meeting once a month that I'd sit in on. And we'd actually create space for what have we learned as a team around our collective immunity. And so they allowed me access to their agenda, which was great. And then we'd build tests inside the LLC that they could start, we'd pair them up, and they say over the next 2 weeks between now and the next time we meet, everybody pick a goal around a behavior change that you can test with someone else on your team, particularly around a high value interaction. And it can be a client, it could be an employee, it could be a project, it could be an email, it could be something that you're going to do differently, and come back and report. And being able to do that in the collective was, I think, accelerated the one-on-one. It created this feeling of safety, and we're all in it together, that no one feels apart. And we created a lot of rules around if you feel stressed, then use the parking lot. We can come back to it. Everybody's on their own pace for uncovering their assumption and how it impacts the cost. And I think that was that part of the arc, getting people to calculate the cost of living in their big assumption. We kept coming to, what is the cost? What is, how has that impacted how we delayed a client, how we didn't address an employee, how we avoided an interaction with each other. And so they began to see that real time, because it's a high interaction environment. People don't sit, because it's very collaborative in nature, but by virtue of they work across disciplines all the time. So they have a lot of time to fight with each other or find a new way of communicating. So their interaction dynamic was present in their culture all the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then what were you starting to think as you're getting toward the end of the coaching arc, the one-to-one work? Were you starting to see some changes in the ways they behaved yet, or was it still?
Absolutely. They were wading into conversation, and they were using some language that I helped them tee up around. So their big assumption, we talked a lot about the story in their head, and the story in their head is code for my big assumption. And now before they could never, because they were subject to it using developmental theory, now they could say the story in my head, that's an object, is that I can't talk to you because you're not going to listen to me. And I'm going to change my behavior around a conversation and realize the story of my head creates a cost around how we interact with each other. So we would do a lot of role playing and experiential learning using that framing, and found that the story in their head became a great code word for understanding how their big assumption. Previously, it's just like, I believe everything that goes through my head is real. Instead of like, I have a lot of things that go through my head that are just assumptions. They never even had a framing or a way of looking at the stuff that we believe to be true is actually mostly assumption based, not evidence based. So we tried to, what's the cost of that? And then what evidence do we have for it? So one funny story, we were sitting in an LLC meeting. I hadn't thought of this when we talked. And because they collect money from developers, and so they have an accounts receivable agent. And so one of the principals had just this aversion to asking clients for money. And he's a founding principal, and he'd say, well, if we ask for money, then we're never going to do work with them again. Like, it's all big assumption stuff. I said, well, how do we know? Have you had that conversation? Like, it's test design on the fly, right? Well, would you be willing to have a conversation with this person and we could report back on it in the next meeting? That would be awesome for everybody. So we didn't gamify it, but we made it very light in terms of overturning assumptions around things that, you know, are emotion or opinion based, because that's all big assumption stuff. Let's get some data and see if like the data tells us something differently.
Yeah.
So that, I think they began to see real time, you know, things began, and they spent a lot less time, you know, fighting over what's on top of the table and more, you know, trying to understand what was under the table.
Yeah, yeah. And then at some point, as I understand it, you started doing some, like a little bit of skill training with them too. Like,
Yeah.
can you say something about, was that during that, the coaching artwork, or did that?
It was absolutely during the coaching artwork. How to listen. We use some of Jennifer Garvey Berger's Listen to Learn as opposed to Listen to Win or Listen to Change. It's all developmental. Some nonviolent communication, which is really creating space for them to make an ask, share what they observe as opposed to what they perceive to be real. So it was a lot of skills based, really around just interpersonal dynamics. Yeah, we got into how to facilitate team meetings, you know, which is really kind of blocking and tackling. But the real learning, I think, was when they began to just listen to each other more deeply, absent of the cloud of their big assumption in the way.
Yeah.
And some frameworks that was helpful, you know, that they could replicate, not only with each other, but then we started going within their teams. You know, so we would work with the 12 leadership. After about 6 to 8 months, I would start working within each of the mechanical, electrical, sustainability, CAD, energy modeling, to help replicate that within the team, because now the leader of the team understands their own big assumption and their sort of their management big assumption. Well, it exists in sub teams as well, and that's when we started I would help facilitate some of the broad ITC, and that's when we started doing some of the engagement assessment to go along with that.